emotion and intelligence. The self is a big, big topic and a very, very important topic that is. The self is probably one of the most important topic that we need to be familiar with. Why? Because the self is that which has difficulties throughout life. So the self is a dynamic construct that changes over time, and the self is perceived as mental or cognitive construct, and also embodies in our physical experiences and action and changes in different situations. And oftentimes, people ask themselves, or at least they should ask, who am I? So, who are you? Who are you? Who am I? Who's Randy? And even though the self is often thought as a single and unified entity, according to William James, which is the father of functional psychology, the self is actually composed of different aspects or dimensions, and he distinguished multiple dimensions of the self in a context of consciousness within two levels of hierarchy. There is the I self and there is the me self. The I self as subjective, which is the existence and the process of knowing, and the me self, which is the object, represents the subjective phenomenology at a higher level and the objective phenomenology at a lower level. And then when it comes to the me self, the observation and accumulation of information of the I self creates three types of knowledge for the me self. So there has to be an I self before there is a me self. And I self accumulates knowledge and information. And this creates a me self at three different layers: material self, social self, and spiritual self. And material self includes the body and the possessions. Social self comes closest to self-esteem, including all characteristics recognized by others. The spiritual self is made of evaluation regarding the self. Evaluation regarding the self, our perceived abilities, attitudes, interests, values, beliefs, opinion, motivation, traits, etc. So when it comes to this evaluation, we're going further. The evaluation also, they come in three different areas, according to William James, the father of functional psychology: the real self, ideal self, and dreaded self. And the difficulties that we have most in life is the dreaded self, because the dreaded self is that part of the self which hasn't been successful yet and is perceived as being unsuccessful or of having bad habits, otherwise known as the ego. And this dreaded self, otherwise known as the ego, is also perceived as a failure to meet social expectations and commonly known as being self-centered and sometimes narcissistic. So the purpose of the self and understanding these different layers of the self is understanding that the self develops in stages by uniting all of these identities, these layers of the self, and living up to social expectations over the factual world problems become much more complex, while these developmental stages bring complex personal, moral, and cultural demands. So the self is a complex construct that comes with I self, the me self as subjective, me self as objective, conscious thoughts, unconscious thoughts, delusions, meta delusions, phenomenology at least three different layers, and so on. So emotional intelligence comes in here very handy and very necessary to help us understand parts of the self and help us unite these different parts of the self with more ease. But what's happening lately, there's a good amount of individuals, even professionally in the mental health field, that they mistaken emotional intelligence teaching for professing psychology. So teaching emotional intelligence and professional psychology are two very different things. And we're going to have Randy talk about the different types of therapists, um, to understand what their school of thought and what lies behind their certification and licensure and their short or long list of ethics and so on. Randy?
Oh, I'm off mute. Okay. Sorry, I thought I was on mute. Well, there are approximately 250 schools of therapy. And what in the world is somebody supposed to do with that? The There are ways to pick a therapist. A person can pick a therapist according to their type of therapy that they do. The most popular ones are CBT for cognitive behavioral therapy, and, and nowadays a hot new one is dialectical behavior therapy, which is a fancy word for different type of therapy. But there are many, 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 many others. The type of therapist that does these can be anybody that's like. The most important thing is not how many letters are behind somebody's name. I saw a posting today on Facebook by somebody who's, I think it's a legitimate therapist. She's an LCSW. She had 10 letters after her name. It was about 4 letters more than what were in her name. And I knew what a few of those designations. I knew what LCSW is and a CCM, but I didn't know what the other letters were. So, what is important is basically two things. One is, are they licensed? If you're going to a therapist, are they licensed? Number one. And number two, is your relationship with them, does it feel right? So, going to a therapist is to go to somebody, if you or somebody else, if you're struggling with emotional or mental struggles or issues. Somebody can go to a hypnotherapist for other issues. Maybe I want to learn how to improve my emotional intelligence. Anybody can teach that. That's a skill that's learned. That's not therapy. That's not a type of therapy. And anybody can, and in fact, anybody can do these other schools of therapy. It's just being very careful about who's monitored, who's licensed. Hypnotherapists are not licensed. They're not regulated that way. Licensed means that there is the state monitors the profession. Is that a big deal? I mean, it is. It's a very important thing. But in my state, Louisiana, hairdressers are licensed. So it doesn't mean that somebody's a genius if they're licensed. Even though hairdressers can be geniuses, I don't mean to imply that they're not all, but it doesn't mean that if a person's license just means that there's an oversight by a governing board. That's all that it means. It doesn't legitimize or delegitimize anything. I'm gonna get myself in hot water with hairdressers now. anyway, um, so the uh, the main thing with hypnotherapy is to make sure that the therapist is certified. And there are several national groups that do certification for hypnotherapists. Some are legit, some aren't. That takes a little more digging. But I have known several hypnotists here and there, and they're trained. They go to a weekend workshop and they get trained, and they call themselves hypnotherapists. And there are some programs that will certify you in hypnotherapy with the weekend training, where the price includes lunch. So just being certified doesn't cut it. If somebody's very interested in it, they should look into who is certified and research who certifies them and research that organization. Karma's certified nationally. I'm certified nationally, but there are lots of people that aren't. And so, but the other thing I'll say, then I'll stop talking, is, for instance, the letters behind somebody's name. If it's an MD or a DO or an NP or a what's the other nurse practitioner? I believe there's another designation for nurse practitioner, which is blocked right this moment. But there are, I think it's, oh, I'm just blocking it. Anyway, those are all medical designations. Those are people who prescribe medicine. PhD is somebody who's gotten a doctorate in psychology. They go to school longer than somebody like me. They're usually smarter than somebody like me. These ones I know are. They're very intelligent people. They do a lot of research, and they spend a lot of time getting their degree and doing post-degree research and so on and so forth. That doesn't make them a better therapist. It just means that they're more educated. Plain and simple. That's all it means. They've gotten more educated. And they've got a bigger student loan probably. So an LCSW is a licensed clinical social worker. That's the highest level a social worker could be. An LPC is the newest one. That's a licensed professional counselor. What's the difference? There's not, I mean, it's splitting hairs, but an LPC, their school of thought was based years ago in education. They tend to be, philosophically speaking, more educationally oriented. That's not true of everyone, and it's changed a lot since those days, but that's sort of their basis. Social work is more focused on social services, and a social work, a licensed clinical social worker is going to probably be more focused on different types of therapy and schools of therapy. That's what they're taught. But I'll tell you, and then there's LPCs, and then there's a whole bunch of others. There's a licensed addictions counselors. There's certified DBT therapists, certified cognitive behavioral therapists, on and on. Just do the research on the internet. It's simple, very simple to do. The important thing is this person certified nationally and or licensed, and do they have a reputation? Is it something do you feel comfortable, you as a client feel comfortable hiring them? Do you feel like they can help you? I will give you an example of somebody I would not use. I called somebody up, and it was a hypnotherapist, for instance, and I said, I just want to know where your training's got. And they say, oh, I did a lot of my own self-training, and these schools of hypnotherapy, they're all a scam. So I did a lot of my self-training. But come on in, we'll talk about it. Can I let me just tell you what my problem is real quick so you can know. Well, no, come on in, and we'll talk about it. I wouldn't go to somebody like that. I would want to make sure they knew if they said to me instead, yes, here's where I trained, here's my website, here's where you can see my credentials, here's where you can see who certified me. Um, let's talk for 10 minutes, no cost, and you give me a very short version of what's going on with you, and then we'll set the first appointment. That's somebody I would probably see. It doesn't mean that they'd be right for me, but that's probably who I would see. And there was one other point I was going to make was, oh, yeah, what uh, Karma was saying in terms of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is is an idea, it's a theory, and it's a skill that's being taught. It's a theory that eventually developed into some skills, listening skills, self-regulation skills, identifying emotion skills. It's a skill thing. It's not therapy. Anybody can do it. The books about emotional intelligence are written for the general public. So it's not some kind of special therapy. It's something anybody, and they want anybody to do it. They think anybody should have it. So somebody can practice emotional therapy. That's emotional intelligence therapy, but that's a little iffy. But yeah, emotional intelligence is a something that is available for anybody, including the general public. So anyway, I hope that clarifies a little bit of
Yeah, thank you, Randy. Yes, that clarifies a little bit on a topic. Um, I had a conversation with a bunch of my colleagues, and I was told that someone was accused of professing psychology just by teaching emotional intelligence. And I'm not sure if that is to be taken as a compliment or as something else. So when it comes to the reason older people might mistake emotional intelligence teaching for psychology, psychotherapy, there are several reasons. One of them would be lack of familiarity of what emotional intelligence is, overlapping concepts, limited exposure to emotional intelligence, language and terminology, preconceived notion, and most definitely limited awareness of evolving fields. So life has been happening so fast at an accelerated rate for the past, at least for the past 20, 30 years. So much knowledge has entered the planet that we don't have time to keep up with all of that. So being educated over what emotional intelligence is necessary nowadays only for the sole purpose of experiencing life at such a accelerated rate. On the other hand, someone that works in a mental health field or just a health field, but more so someone that's employed in a mental health field, I would assume and I would preconceive that they would be familiar with what emotional intelligence is. But apparently not everybody is, which is okay. That's why we have this podcast, me and Randy, to educate on emotional intelligence skills, and all as much as we get to do it publicly about emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence is a concept and a field of study that has gained a prominence relatively recently. Salovey, Meyer, and Salovey, they published it beginning 1990, 1990. Well, in 1990 in Romania, the field of psychology just started to take, to begin to exist. Emotional intelligence in 1990 over here in the United States started to take off. So, of course, there will be older individuals that might not be familiar with some of the terms and specificity when it comes to emotional intelligence. And there are overlapping concepts and language when it comes to emotional intelligence and psychology, and some of them they share some common area of focus, such as understanding human behavior, understanding your triggers, understanding your emotions, and understanding interpersonal relationships. But emotional intelligence teaching and training and skills is not the same as psychotherapy, right? And this overlap can leads to the confusion, especially if an older person has a background of familiarity with traditional psychology teachings. So I would assume that in continuing education, at least over here in the United States, some will emphasize some emotional intelligence concepts. Another, when it comes to that overlapping concepts, there is language and terminology that is used in emotional intelligence teaching, such as self-awareness, empathy, emotional regulation, which may resemble psychological concepts, which might lead to the perception that emotional intelligence is a subset or branch of psychology. Which is not, right? It's just similar terminology and an overlap of common language and terminology, and what we do with that language and terminology. Another good reason for mistakenly make false accusation would be a limited exposure to emotional intelligence. Because emotional intelligence may not have been widely discussed or emphasized during someone's formative years many years ago. If someone grew up before 1990s, emotional intelligence wasn't, emotional intelligence started to take off in the United States that I'm aware of in 1990s. In Romania, emotional intelligence, it's probably, when did it enter? It's hard to say, but Romania started developing psychology as a field in 1990, and psychology as a field was well developed in the United States in 1990. So it helps us understand why would an older person would misconstrue emotional intelligence teaching for psychotherapy. And preconceived notion is always a troublemaker, because that's when we have misunderstanding because of the preconceived notions. And older individual may have the preconceived notions about what constitutes psychology and may assume that any teaching related to emotion and behavior fall under the domain of psychology. And that might have been so many years ago, but with the emergence of emotional intelligence, with the emergence of NLP, with the emotion of specific language that helps us understand emotions and empathy and self-awareness and that helps us better understand who we are, what we do, why we do, beliefs and values, and habits that those preconceived notions are not helping. And last but not least is the limited awareness of evolving fields. If we look at the medical doctors, when was it? Some doctors were talking about in 2020 that the medical field research doubles so quickly that every 17th day, and this was a few years ago, every 17th day it would double in quantity, research, information, knowledge. It is impossible to keep track with all of that, but we can keep track with the concepts of what's available. We don't necessarily have to be experts with all that it is available, because making false accusation, it's not good. And knowledge and fields of study, they evolve over time, and it can be challenging for some individuals to keep up with the latest developing. Well, it's challenging with any individual lately. That's the amount of information that we are bombarded with. It's hard to keep track of. But when we conceptualize something, it makes it much easier to compartmentalize and conceptualize things. Emotional intelligence as a distinct field may not have been on other people's radar, or may have emerged after their educational years. And that could say a lot about them keeping up with what's evolving and the behavioral field. Because not everybody, well, emotional intelligence evolving as a field and teaching us how to acquire skills to okay, I'm not going to go that route. It's quite a gift. It's quite a gift to humanity, to everybody. Well, it's a gift to humanity, but has become a requirement in the business world long enough ago. When did I wrote my first book? In 2013 I started writing my books, and emotional intelligence was a requirement. Yeah, that was 10 years ago. Was a requirement at that time already. And not everybody that needs to understand their behavior, not everybody that needs to learn how to manage their emotions and develop empathy and compassion and building leadership skills and building team needs to have psychotherapy. But we all need emotional intelligence teachings and skills and knowledge about the concept, because it helps us go through life with more ease, and we can certainly, most definitely, have more ease. We could have that at any time and all the time, because we are bombarded with the acceleration of life and information that we are faced with. Randy?
Yes, that's exactly right. Emotional intelligence became very popular too because there was a book written about it, number one, and it made headlines because the author, I can't remember, he's a psychologist, he theorized that emotional intelligence was more important than IQ, to our regular intelligence.
Yeah, that's Peter
And
Salovey.
a lot.
Mayer and Salovey. Yeah.
That was major headlines. It was a big deal, and that kind of brought emotional intelligence to the forefront, because in our culture, at least in this country, our culture, being intelligent is considered very high. It puts one in a very high social status, usually, not everyone, but typically. Our society rewards, and it doesn't. It takes 10 minutes to be on the radio, turn the radio on, and hear somebody saying, "Well, we're going to interview somebody from Harvard now, and here's a Harvard law professor," that kind of thing. So intelligence. So when emotional intelligence came out, they said, "Well, this is more important than being mentally intelligent. This is more important." Made headlines, and there's some. I don't know. Your Carmen's the expert on it, but what little I know about it is that it does help people have a more improved life, and it helps in places like work, where these days in our work environment, it's more important than being the smartest person in the room. I grew up in the, I'm very old, and I grew up in the Vietnam War era, and in this country. And those of our vast audience here who remember those days remember that the people that got us into Vietnam were considered the most intelligent people in the country, some of the most. One of them was the head of Ford Motor Company, and they were considered. There was a book written about this whole era. It's called "The Best and the Brightest," and that describes it perfectly. The best and the brightest. They were the smartest people in the country, and they got us into Vietnam. So intelligence. So in my generation, my older boomer generation, we used to be proud to be boomers. Now it's kind of a badge of, now it's dishonor. But anyway, the us boomers tend to, generally speaking, be wary of this. Oh, the smarter somebody is, the better. It's nice to be smart. I wish I was smart, but emotional intelligence is something anybody can learn. It has no basis in education or intellectual ability. It's something anybody can learn, and skills, and hypnotherapy can enhance that, because it can help people practice those skills in a very effective way. 1 or 2 sessions. You could make an appointment with Carmen for 2 or 3 sessions and say, "Can you teach me some emotional intelligence skills?" And you would leave having a much better ability to use those skills.
Yes, you are correct.
So yes, and just one other thing is,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
to clarify, or just to emphasize, is that emotional intelligence is not psychotherapy, no more than improving self-esteem is psychotherapy. Emotional intelligence is a set of skills available to anybody. It has nothing to do with psychotherapy. So yes.
Yeah, thank you, Randy. Thank you for enlightening us. And you are not old, if you ask me. What do I click on?
Well, I'll have to start asking you a lot.
All right. No, you're not old whatsoever. Okay, so what emotional intelligence, it's an absolute necessity when it comes to relationship. And someone just made a comment that emotional intelligence is important for relationship. Yes, it is, and it's highly important for relationship. And what are relationship? Well, relationship, it's a big topic of conversation, and we can definitely have a lot of podcasts on that. But some of the topics that emotional intelligence teaches us our self-awareness. And you don't have to do psychotherapy to become self-aware. Emotional regulation, which there's plenty of strategies and techniques for managing and regulating emotions for you to make informed decision and foster positive relationship. And the interesting thing is that many years ago, having a high IQ was valued over high EQ, emotional intelligence, but a lot of the high IQ in a work area, a lot of those people were not nice people. They were rude and demeaning and condescending to other people, and that's not good in an organization. It takes the whole team down. So there was a need to have these people focus on regulating their emotion as well, and also focusing on understanding the role of their self-awareness and the impact of the impact they have over the impact that their behavior and their communication style has over other people. Other skills that emotional intelligence goes over its empathy and social awareness. Empathy is and social awareness are better understood as being able to connect with others, put yourself in other shoes, and don't be so judgmental, and try to understand things from their perspective, which is not always very easy to do, but with a proper levels of emotional intelligence, that becomes easier to do. One of the most important thing you will ever learn from emotional intelligence is communication and active listening. Oftentimes during communication, when people talk, there's a conversation between two people, you might not, okay, how do I say this? Oftentimes people are waiting to make their statement to say what they're about to say, as opposed to listening to what the other people is saying. And effective communication and active listening skill, it's very important for building trust, fostering collaboration, resolving conflicts, and of course enhancing relationships. And building resilience also is very important, to build and develop resilience to navigate all the challenges and all the setbacks and all the stress in all of the roles we have in life. How many layers and levels of the self did I present earlier? Quite an enough number. But when we take that and go into the parts theory, that's going to get even more complex, right? So it's very important to develop this resilience. And we don't need to have psychotherapy to develop resilience. Some people do, some people don't. The decision making, it's so important. Making decision out of emotion at an emotionally aroused moment, it's not recommended. I always caution people to refrain from making life-altering decision during difficult times. Why? Because it's because it's very important. Because the decision you make when you are going through an emotionally aroused situation, a couple of minutes, a couple of hours, or a couple of days, the decision you make at that time is going to be a very different decision should you have experienced different set of emotions. So emotions impact us tremendously, and they affect what we do, how we perceive, how we feel, decisions that we make. And we make decisions, um, we make a lot of unconscious decisions that it's very, it's highly emotional intelligence for us to become aware of the decisions that we make, um, consciously and unconsciously. And conflict resolution, just by building empathy and communication with active listening skills, um, uh, there will be no conflict. It would be just communication, understanding that a difference of opinion is oftentimes welcome, and it can be a resource um, full of potential for growth, full of potential for expansion, and something that doesn't have to evolve into a conflict. But we are so, as human beings, we are so busy being in conflict with arguing with another, um, that is very wise to develop some emotional intelligence skills to for your own benefit, because the more conflict you experience, the more unhappy you are, and life is not pleasant, and it's not enjoyable, um, unless unless conflict is something that you really look forward to and enjoy the conflict. We sometimes you enjoy, but not at someone else's expense. And if you enjoy conflict, by all means, there's lots of sports that you can go engage in and go ahead and enjoy your conflict release in a sports team. But to constantly be in conflict with other people, it's not, doesn't help you, doesn't help them. Having a difference of opinion, that will always provide an opportunity for growth and expansion as opposed to conflict. Reflection, self-reflection, self-reflection is very important for you becoming self-aware, for developing emotional intelligence skill. It's important for personal growth, for continuous learning, leadership development. And what I'm finding interesting lately, that leadership development is a terminology that is used a lot lately, and leadership development doesn't necessarily, is not restricted to leadership in an organizational environment only. There are different types of leadership, and in family settings, we need leadership role. We need leadership, some sort of leadership role when we drive a car. We are leading something. Right now, me and Randy are in a leadership role when we are providing this podcast. So leadership encompasses, again, it's a terminology that encompasses a lot, and it's not limited only to being a leader and leading a team, although that's how it has a lot to do with that, but that's not all there is to it. And then growth mindset, embracing a growth mindset to foster ongoing development and overcome challenges again. So instead of having conflict, difference of opinion and challenges, and allowing these challenges to propel you to further grow, that's much more healthy. It's a healthier way to live life. And then authenticity. Authenticity is that which is going to help you understand the layers of self, become self-aware, and become more authentic with who you are, and being appropriately authentic in the environment that you're in at any given moment. Authenticity, again, is a very big word that oftentimes is misrepresented in a conversation. Like, I'm Romanian, for example, and some would expect me to would understand me as being authentic only when I speak Romanian, or only when I follow authentic Romanian culture, traditions, food, clothing, things like that, which there is a national authenticity, there is cultural authenticity, traditional authenticity, but that's not what an individual authenticity is limited to. And the secret is that with all of the personal growth and with all of the therapies, how long ago was I in a weekend full of training at various different therapy modalities, because now there are so many different types of therapy with a therapist, that with every single technique and every single approach, all of them came down to the self. Why? Because if you're authentic, if you're emotional intelligence, if you're authentic, if you have the self, if you unite those layers of the self, and I'm not talking about parts. Well, we can do parts, and we can talk about parts later on. Then you become authentic, and then when you become authentic, it's easier to be vulnerable, because when you're authentic, integrity automatically comes with it. I don't see situations where you can as the self, as an authentic self. I do not see a situation where you would have an authentic self without integrity. For me, maybe other people can say it, but I do not. And once you step into this authenticity of yours, which takes a little bit of time to get back to it, because when we were children, we were just so authentic. Life was full of possibilities, and we wanted to do things, we wanted to learn things, we wanted to take things apart to see how they work, and then parents and teachers and religious leader told us that that's not the way to do things. The way to do things is this way, my or the highway. This is the right and the wrong and the white and the black. And that's good up to a point, and it's very important. But after a while, taking all of this teaching in consideration, that there is a right and wrong, and there is duality, but polarity, there is a difference between duality and polarity, and embracing your authentic self with integrity and compassion and self-awareness and empathy. This is what we are striving for in life. This is where we're heading to. This is what all of the therapy. We go to therapy because something is not working right. Something bothers us. Something doesn't work well. So as with all of the therapy that we go through all the steps, eventually we have to arrive to the self without being selfish, because arriving to the self and arriving to the authenticity of the self doesn't mean that you're going to be selfish. Randy?
Yeah, we could have a whole podcast on authenticity it's one of the things I like your idea of integrity and honesty. Those make I understand those better than I do the concept of authenticity. And here's why: is that, and I maybe I'm missing something somewhere, but some of the most psychopathic people in the world are authentic. There's a guy in a Romanian custody right now. Speaking of Romania, his name's Andrew Tate, very popular YouTuber, millions and millions and millions of followers. 99% of them are male. They're in their 20s. They're very, very lost people, in my opinion. No offense, but he 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 espouse a he's a psychopath, in my opinion. And I can't. I'm not diagnosing him. I just psychopath's not a diagnosis anyway. But he just has these. He's been arrested now and charged with trafficking, and there's some court documents that have come out that shows he obviously was into sex trafficking with very young women. A very, very dislikable person, and if you can listen to about 5-10 minutes on him on YouTube, and he's just insane, but he's very popular. To me, he's very authentic. He's pure as he can be in the sense that he is who he is. So I struggle with being authentic because I just know a lot of psychopaths that are very authentic. So anyway, I know I'm missing the boat on it somewhere. I must be, but
You're
that's
not
what I struggle with.
you're not missing the boat, and you make a very good point, because to the same token, um, when talking to my Romanian friends, plenty of them assume that being authentic is it's having the authenticity of the Romanian culture, traditions, clothing, values, and keeping that authenticity. And um, authenticity is authenticity is I well no, no, those are, they're not authentic, because these people that are intentionally harming others, they have some authentic emotion, they have some authentic anger, they have some authentic derangement, but I don't see them as authentic self.
So would you say that Harvey Weinstein was not an authentic person?
That kind of a person would,
You know who I'm talking about?
yes, well, that's not how I see the authentic self. That person is a criminal.
'Cause I read a book about him,
Uh-huh.
and I read stuff. It's very interesting. He seemed as authentic as hell to me. He wasn't trying to hide anything. He didn't have any kind of hidden agenda. I mean, he was who he was, and for 30 years in Hollywood, everyone knew who he was and did business with him, and it was all, all. In other words, he wasn't putting on a facade. He wasn't being fake. He
Oh,
wasn't.
okay,
He
okay,
he.
let me interrupt that. Being authentic is not the opposite of fakeness. But someone like you describe, I don't care to reproduce their name because I don't care to honor them. Someone like that is obviously an ill person, and they have an overinflated sense of self. And the sense of self is the I self and the me self and self evaluation. Their self evaluation is out of it's derailed, and the when it in between the I self and the me self, there's a bit too much. It's an out of balance towards the object the phenomenology, experiencing the me-self as an object to the material self, and ignoring the social self and the spiritual self. Because the spiritual self, the essence of who we are, it's less likely to go inflict our harm on others. And someone who's, you mentioned the other guy, don't reproduce their name because I don't want to honor them by stating their name. When they go harm others and abuse others and oppress others, they are lacking something very essential from their self. I self, me self. The me self, material self, social self, spiritual self. Self-evaluation, we have real self, ideal self, dreaded self. So in order for the self to become authentic, all of this need to be united in simple terms. Carl Jung called this the process of individuation. And yes, these people I accept their shadow and embrace their shadow, but no, I do not see them as authentic. I see them as we shouldn't have. I see them as they need to be thrown in jail, and one of them was, and the other one is, what did you say? It was arrested, and don't pronounce their name again. I don't care to call their name again. They are severely lacking the understanding of the I self and the other parts of the self. But you have a gift, Randy. You have a gift to go to take this to this polarity, which is so valuable in this context, because something needs to be clarified. And if you wouldn't have taken this polarity, I wouldn't have made this clarification. And this is at least from my point of view, because that is a complete lack of emotional intelligence for someone to hurt somebody, to abuse them, to rape them and sex trafficking, and that is it's a zero emotional intelligence level, and on top of that, even being condescending and demeaning someone's value, that's a lower level of emotional intelligence. So in order to unite the self, you need to elevate your emotional intelligence level. So how's that?
Yeah, that makes sense. And those were very extreme examples. I think all of us have been around people. I don't know, in the medical field that I've been involved in for most of my professional life. There's just a lot of people who it's very dog eat dog, for lack of a better term. And I don't know if it's a lack of emotional intelligence. The people seem authentic. Now, these are not extremes like I was talking about. These are just regular people, but they do. There's a lot of, and I'm way exaggerating, but I've been around. I've worked with medical people who are bullies. Just can be very difficult. And when people say, I want to be more authentic, I think sometimes of those people, I think, if I asked this, I worked for a nurse once who was just a monster. And I don't mean, I mean, just a very difficult person to work with. She eventually was fired because she was stealing from the company that I worked for, the hospital.
Wow.
But before that happened, she made life miserable for a bunch of us. And if I asked her, or if somebody said, do you feel like you're living an authentic life? I think she'd say, oh, 100%. You better believe it. I'm full of life. So it's a weird concept in me. I can point the finger and say, "Oh, she's not authentic." That's obvious. But if somebody asked her, I know she would say, "Oh, I'm the most authentic person in the whole city of Baton Rouge." And so, it's just a concept I'm not sure I understand. That's
Uh,
pretty clear. That's very obvious, and that's very authentic.
yes, it is. That's an authentic thought. But let me bring an image over here on the screen. Hopefully, you can see it too. If not, if you don't see the image, Randy, maybe you can turn your tab into the Facebook where this is streaming. And if we look at the this the conscious experiences of the self, at least 35% of the self and I self and me self, it is unconscious. It contains delusions, and it contains meta delusions and delusions of lack of recognitions of conscious thoughts. So these people, again, they may have an authentic emotion and an authentic need to dominate and an authentic need to be put on a pedestal and an authentic narcissistic inclination or authentic psychopathic inclination, authentic sociopathic inclination, yeah, but not the authentic self. If we look at functional psychology as taught by William James, father of functional psychology, and then looking at the process of individuation as per Carl Jung, the father of psychoanalytical psychology. Within the conscious experience of the I self, we have the me self as subjective, and then we have the me self as objective. Me self as subjective at a higher level, and me self objective as a lower level. And in this image, you can see the me self subjective at higher level in this gray area, where the me self objective phenomenology in the lower level in the white area. And these two higher level and the lower level of the me self experience has at least 3 different layers. And if we are looking at the visual experience, only just taking the visual experience because it's easy to explain, within the visual experience, the me self at the higher level and the me self at the lower levels goes like this in 3 layers. At a subjective highest level of the me self, the experience would be I see a hand. I, as the me, I see a hand. It's more general. In the other level, it goes a bit more specific, into which it says, I see your hand. It becomes a bit more specific. The visual experience of seeing your hand is not just a hand, but it's your hand, so there's more precise. And when it gets to the objective me self phenomenology level, then it goes into I see my hand. So the me self is complex through all of the senses. the visual, olfactory, auditory, tactile, also imagination and abstract thoughts. But what's interesting at this level of conscious thoughts, I'm talking about just conscious thoughts right now, at this level of conscious thoughts, the pain and the emotions are experienced differently as an objective phenomenology. As a subjective phenomenology, most individuals are going to experience some of this visual, olfactory, auditory, tactile at these three levels. But as an objective phenomenology, pain and emotions are going to be experienced differently. So here's another good reason of why emotional intelligence is such an important and such a necessity nowadays. How did this go into your understanding of authenticity, the way I'm approaching authentic self?
Yeah, that makes sense better. Yeah, it's used so much, it's kind of psychobabble by a lot of people, but that makes sense.
All right.
It's interesting. It's an interesting discussion. I don't. When I was doing therapy and as a hypnotist, I've never had anybody in therapy anyway come in and say, I want to pay you $100 an hour so I can be more authentic. I don't think I'm authentic enough. So it's kind of it's sort of a theory that the regular people probably, it's something for therapists to be aware of, and counselors, and coaches, and hypnotherapists, and those kind of coaching kind of things, because, like you said, it's so important. But in terms of what people pay us to help them do, it's usually not to become more authentic.
Not in psychotherapy, because psychotherapy is pathology oriented. But hypnotherapy and at least Ericksonian hypnotherapy is not pathology oriented, it's solution oriented. So when you look for solution, tailoring, utilization strengths, we look at the client's strengths. What are their strengths? What are their needs? What are their strengths? And that's going to fall immediately into their authenticity. And are we all aware of what's authentic? When we are authentic, when we're not authentic? It takes acquiring a bunch of skills to know when you are in your authentic self. And do I have some really cool skills to teach on that? But as the self is a being dynamic construct, so this authenticity becomes dynamic and appropriate to the circumstance at hand. And no, you're right. People are not gonna know. Well, I want to become more authentic. No, but you will hear people saying nowadays, I want to become the best person that I could be. I want to become valuable to society. I want to provide service to my fellow humans. Now, that is someone who wants to step into their authenticity. And why have they not stepped into? By now they have, but there's still some areas within the self where they have a lot of social expectations, whether it's from their job, whether it's from their religion, from their family. There's a bunch of expectations that they have not met, these other expectations that doesn't give them room to be their authentic self. And then it's also the misunderstanding that if they step into their authentic self, then they're not going to fulfill these social expectations, which is not so, because it's just a matter of a reframing. So NLP helps with that, hypnotherapy helps with that, coaching helps with that, emotional intelligence helps with that. And again, we're going to go back to the great magic of hypnotherapy, which lies into the fact that with hypnosis, you get into the deeper layers of yourself. And you find out, you work with your subconscious and you take out those parts of the self which are not serving you, things that you don't like. But uh, people like those two you mentioned, don't mention their name again, they don't care to do that. They're very stuck into their meta delusions, and it's a lack of recognition of their conscious thoughts, and they're very happy into the material, objective phenomenology experience of the self. Yes?
Sounds good.
All right. All right. So that should be all for today, for tonight. Thank you for everybody's feedback, and we've taken some questions. We're going to address this question later on in the next podcast. Thank you, everybody. Um, Thank you, and good night.